are in our second week of the sermon series, Changed for Good, and today our reading comes from Genesis in the 18th chapter, verses 1 through 15. I invite you to open a Bible and read it along with me, or you will find the scripture passage for this morning on the front of your Growth Rate study guide. Hear now these words. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw three men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me give you something to eat so you can be refreshed, and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered. "Do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 sheaves of the finest flour and knead it and make some bread." Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf and gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. "Where's your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he said. Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, now will I have pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I did not laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did laugh." This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
See, instead of saying thanks be to God, we should have all laughed together. That would have been the better response, probably. Oh. Does anybody remember the old Heinz ketchup commercial? What does it say? Yeah. It's making me wait. Carly Simon singing in that sultry voice of hers as we all watched on the television as the ketchup just slowly tried to make its way out of the bottle and finally landed on the juicy hamburger so that it would be prepared. What?
Kids today don't have
Yeah, now we have squirt bottles. You don't have to worry about that. No waiting, right? Heinz really knew how to make waiting seem worthwhile in that commercial. But I think Carolyn's probably on to something in our culture today. There's not much market really for waiting in our world, is there? We don't really enjoy waiting. And, some voices might say, good things come to those who wait. But that voice is drowned out by carpe diem. Seize the day, seize the day. Some would say all in due time, while others say the early bird gets the worm. You got to get out there and do it yourself and make it happen now, right now. I used to love to go and visit my Uncle Bill. He was a religion professor and he lived in Idaho. And he was an avid bird watcher. So he would sit quietly for long periods of time with his binoculars to look for birds that he had already heard, because sitting in the quiet, he could wait for them to make their sound, and he knew what they were, even just by the sound, and he would teach my sister and me, how to listen for the sounds of certain birds and how to spot them. He sat quietly every day and fully finished the New York Times crossword puzzle. He lived a quiet life of solitude and intellect. One day, my dad, who was the youngest of the brothers, received a phone call from Uncle Bill. "I'm getting married," he said, "and I want you to be my best man." My Uncle Bill was 75. 75. The first time, the only time that he married. You see, he went to Maryville College, not too far from here, and fell in love with a sweet girl, his college sweetheart, and I don't know what happened. What happened happens to a lot of people. They just went their separate ways after a while. She married and had a family, and he moved into professorship and spent his life teaching in the classroom, and they met back up by chance. Or not so much by chance, maybe. But they met back up at their college reunion. She was widowed. They fell in love again, and he married her at 75. He became a husband, a father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather, all on the same day. It all happened in due season. He was a quiet man, but I wonder if there were times throughout his life, or how many times, in fact, throughout his life, when nobody else was around, whether he might have just shaken his fist at God a little bit and wondered when that promise might come true for him, or whether he had laughed, maybe in resignation, and thought it will never happen. What I've hoped for is past. Maybe the time has come and gone for me. Until one day, he woke up at the age of 75, and it was his wedding day. All in due season. God first spoke to Abraham when he was 75 years old. "Go from your country and your kindred into a land that I will show you. Go, and I will make of you a great nation." And Abraham went with his wife Sarah, who was 66. He could have asked, "So what? I'm just supposed to drop everything now? All the stuff I've built up right here in my community, in my life, I'm just supposed to drop it all and leave?" But instead, Genesis tells us that Abraham went with his wife and followed God's promise. And I think about life sometimes and the way we say things happen. I mean, you move out of your home maybe to go to college or to the military or to get a job, and you move kind of out on your own for the first time, and life is a big adventure, and you find out what's going on. Maybe you sow a few wild oats, and you move, and then you move again, and you find a job, and maybe you switch jobs, and you do all of that, but then you settle down into a routine of life. And by midlife, much less 75, things should be pretty much settled, it seems. That is, until God shows up and makes promises to you and decides that it is time for a change. Chapter 12 is where it begins for Abraham. God's first visit to him when he's 75 and she's 66, and they pick up and they move, and then they move, and then they move some more, and when famine comes to the land, they even have to move into Egypt and live there as exiles for a while, and when they move back out of Egypt, God comes to him again and says, "Look around you, to the north and south and the east and the west, look all around. Everything that you see, I'm going to give to you. Look up at the stars. More than you can count. Your children will number more than all of these stars." And in chapter 17, God appears to Abraham yet again. This time he's 99, not 75 or 84. He's 99. It's been 14 years since that first promise and conversation. And God says to Abraham, I will give you a son by Sarah. She's 90. No big deal. And what did Abraham do? We don't often read this section. We hear about Sarah laughing quite often. But in chapter 17, when God says this promise to Abraham, Abraham does exactly what Sarah did. He laughs. He falls on his face. And he laughs and he says, can a child be born to a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman? We hear it from Sarah. But Abraham does it too. I imagine that laughter might have been, maybe buried in that laughter might have been some questions and some thoughts that weren't expressed in the text. Like, great, 99, and now you're going to change my life yet again? I mean, I moved and I did all the things you said in the promise, and I did what you wanted, but now I'm finally settled again. And just as I've gotten settled, this is what you're going to give for me. Again, promise of more change. I'm too old for this, God. I am just too worn out for this. Or maybe he was thinking, sure, God, I'll believe it when I see it. And I'm wondering if Sarah thought maybe that old Abraham was just a little touched in the head all those years, those 14 years when he'd been coming home and saying, honey, guess what God said to me today? Guess what the next promise is? But here in chapter 18, as we read it this morning, God shows up yet again, this time in the form of 3 messengers. And Sarah, for the first time, hears the promise for herself. Not secondhand, but firsthand. Is it any wonder that she too laughs? How many times have you laughed at God's suggestion of change for your life? How many times has that change seemed so improbable to you? I was a teacher and a mother and a wife in my 30s when God called me to leave my home and my land at Harvest Christian Retreat and travel to Lexington Theological Seminary, where Tim and I left our jobs and our security. I was not straight out of college. I thought, this is what seminary is about. You go to college, get a religion degree, and then you go to seminary. That's what those folks do. I had a theater degree. I was teaching high school, and all of a sudden, I'm laughing. And God, do what now? You want me to go where? The average age, as I found out when I went to Lexington, was 50. Students going into seminary at that time were almost all second career or third career students. But there was one woman in my seminary class named Sherry, and she was 67 years old. She thought her life was settled. She was a retired government worker. She had a great pension, and all of a sudden, in her little town, in her little house in Ohio, God showed up and said, hey, Sherry, I got a promise for you. I need you to move. She had this nice idea of retirement, she told us. And when she retired, she had 3 friends at different times who were friends, of hers in different settings, who said to her, I always thought that you'd be a minister. Or I can't even imagine you being retired. You know what you should do? You always taught Sunday school. You should go to seminary. 3 times. She told her daughter about it one day. It's ridiculous, these friends of mine. I don't know what they're thinking. And her daughter opened up Genesis 18. Mom, you taught me to read the Bible. And here it is. 3 messengers. from God have come to you and said, I've got this idea for your life. So when she was 67, Sherry moved from Ohio to Lexington, and she started this new chapter in her life. It was a chapter of God's promise for her. But it wasn't just for her, it was a promise for all the people that she would touch with her ministry throughout the rest of her life. And you know, I love God, but God has some really crazy timing, really, really outrageous ideas for us. I mean, my Uncle Bill was married at 75. Sherry started a whole new chapter in her life in ministry at 67. Sarah is promised that she will have a child when she is 90. Just when you think you are settled for good, God comes along and promises something better. Not just better for you, but better for your family, better for the community, or better for the world. There are any number of moments in Abraham's life where I'm sure he has no good reason to believe that something good will come. But somehow he risks it all, and he does it to live in this promise from God. And even when that promise is said to come in some due season that he cannot even see or feel, when there are so many things that he has given up in order to follow God's promise instead of his own way, he says yes. Maybe some of you know who Shauna Nyquist is. She's the author of several books, one entitled Bittersweet, about change. She says this: it's not hard to decide what you want your life to be about. What's hard is figuring out what you're willing to give up in order to do the things you really care about. This is what I've come to believe about change, she writes. It's good in the way that childbirth is good, and heartbreak is good, and failure is good. And by that, I mean that it is incredibly painful and exponentially more so if you try to fight it. And also that it has the potential to open you up, to open life up, and to deliver you right into the palm of God's hand, which is where you wanted to be all along. Except that you were too busy pushing and pulling your life into exactly what you thought it should be. I've learned the hard way that change is one of God's greatest gifts and most useful tools. That it's not something to run from, as though we could anyway. And that, in many cases, change is a function of God's graciousness. What does it mean to trust in God's promise for better when you think that things are settled for good? It means opening yourself up to change. What are you willing to change? What are you willing to give up, to risk? What are you willing to pay in order to follow where God leads you and where God calls you? Or are you convinced that things are settled for good? That the way things are is the way things will always be? Can God do something more with your life? Can God take you and do something extraordinary? What does the text say near the end? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I think most of us walk around a good bit of the time acting as if God is not active in the world. I know I can do it. I know I can become cynical in my thinking. And sometimes someone will say to me, this thing happened, this amazing thing happened, and God saved me, God intervened, and God directed my steps, God healed me, God was guiding my car or my life, and I tend to laugh to myself in those times, even when I'm nodding my head and say things like, inside of myself, of course, yeah, sure, that was good love, or good timing, or good medicine. Then, But then I remember Genesis 18. I remember that if God can show up in the form of 3 dudes in the desert in the middle of the day, the heat of the day, when, by the way, exactly nobody who lives in the desert goes about traveling. If God can show up there, then God can show up at the grocery store and at the hospital and on the street corner and in the retirement home. God can show up when we're 43 or 75 or 99. God can show up when we least expect it. God can show up and we just might find ourselves changed for good. And then the only question that we will have left is, will we recognize God in that moment? And will we be receptive to God's presence and God's promise for our lives? And when God shows up, not if, you notice I didn't say if, when God shows up in that unexpected time, instead of asking, so what am I supposed to do now? Am I supposed to give up? Am I supposed to drop everything? Maybe our faithful response, maybe the only faithful response, is a simple, yes, Lord. Yes, Lord, I will live in your promise. God, I hope it's so. May it be so for all of us. Amen.